October 1919. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the cotton fields surrounding Waco. In a small wooden house on the outskirts of town, where floorboards creaked with every step and paint had long since peeled from the heat, a boy was born. They named him Doris, a name his parents had chosen expecting a daughter. When a sturdy boy arrived instead of a girl, they didn't bother changing the paperwork. For a black family in Texas, every trip to government offices could turn into humiliation. Connery and Henrietta Miller worked as sharecroppers. Their hands knew only two states: work and pain. Doris was the third of 4 children, and his childhood differed little from that of thousands of other black children in the South. At 6 years old, he was already walking into the fields alongside his parents, cotton scratching his small palms. School was available only a few months each year, after the harvest was collected and before the next season began. The world around him was divided by rigid lines. Water fountains marked whites only and colored only. Separate entrances to stores, back seats on buses. Jim Crow laws determined every step, every action. This was a reality you didn't argue with, you simply lived it. But Doris grew strong. By adolescence, his shoulders had broadened, his arms grown powerful. On the school football team, he was one of the best players. His teammates knew if it came down to it, Doris wouldn't let them down. He didn't look for fights, spoke little, but his presence was calming. By 19, the future looked simple and bleak. Cotton fields, sharecropping, poverty passed down from generation to generation, like a family name. But in the spring of 1938, Navy recruiters appeared in town. They promised regular pay, food, uniforms. For a young black man from Texas, this was one of the few ways out. In September 1938, Doris Miller raised his right hand and took the oath. Basic training in Norfolk, Virginia began with separation. White recruits to the right, black recruits to the left. Even medical examinations were conducted in different rooms. Doris quickly understood. The racial line that ran through Texas ran through the Navy, too. Only here, it was even sharper. The naval forces had a simple rule for African Americans: stewards and cooks. That's it. No gunners, no technicians, no radio operators. Official policy stated that black men were incapable of complex technical work. Doris, who could take apart and reassemble any mechanism on the farm, was assigned to peel potatoes. His first assignment was the supply ship USS Pyro. The work was monotonous: galley, stove, sink full of dirty dishes. Day after day, week after week. He sent most of his pay home, $21 a month. For his family, this was serious money. Then he was transferred to the battleship USS Nevada, then, in January 1940, to the USS West Virginia. A massive warship, one of the marvels of American engineering. 8 main battery guns capable of hitting targets 20 miles away. Armor a foot thick. A crew of 1,500 men, each knowing his job. Doris cooked their breakfasts. The West Virginia was based in Pearl Harbor. Hawaii greeted him with warm breezes, the smell of the ocean, and palm trees. After dusty Texas, this was almost paradise. Almost. Because racial lines existed here, too. There were bars where black sailors shouldn't enter. There were streets where it was better not to appear after sunset. But on the ship, there was a life of its own. Doris boxed, participated in competitions between crews. His punches were heavy as sledgehammer blows. After one fight, the ship's captain, seeing him on deck, stopped and said, "You fight well, sailor." It was rare recognition. Life flowed steadily. Morning wake-up, galley, cooking, cleaning, occasionally shore leave. On weekends, Doris wrote letters home. short, without unnecessary words. "Mama, everything's fine. Weather's good. Sending money." He didn't complain. Complaining wasn't in his nature. By the end of 1941, something troubling hung in the air. Newspapers wrote about tensions with Japan, about diplomatic negotiations that led nowhere. But in Pearl Harbor, people thought little about it. Warships stood at anchor in neat rows. Crews carried out routine duties. The Pacific Ocean lived up to its name. Sunday, a day when you could relax a little. But for a cook, Sunday began the same as any other day, with darkness and the galley. Doris woke at 5 in the morning. Outside the porthole it was still night. He washed with cold water, dressed, and went down to the galley. He turned on the stoves, pulled out supplies. Breakfast for the officers had to be ready by 7. The ship was quiet. Most of the crew was still sleeping. Only the watch walked the decks, their steps echoing dully on metal. At 7:55 a.m., the silence was torn by a sound you couldn't mistake for anything else. The low rumble of engines. Many engines. Then, explosions. Distant but distinct. Doris looked outside and saw black columns of smoke over neighboring ships and airfields. Battle stations. The clang of the bell cut through the ship from bow to stern. Sailors ran from berthing compartments, pulling on uniforms as they moved, not understanding what was happening. A drill? But the explosions sounded too real. Doris dropped everything and ran to the upper deck. He had no battle station. Cooks weren't given them. But instinct demanded he move upward, where he could see what was happening. What he saw looked unreal. Planes with red circles on their wings swept over the harbor, dropping bombs and torpedoes. Enormous columns of water rose where torpedoes struck ships. Over Ford Island Airfield, black smoke billowed, American planes burning right on the ground. At 7:57, the first torpedo struck the West Virginia. The ship shuddered like a living creature receiving a blow. Metal groaned. Somewhere below came the roar of water rushing through the breach. Then a second torpedo, a third. The ship began listing to port. On the bridge, Captain Benyon tried to coordinate the crew's actions, but at that moment, a shell hit the neighboring battleship Tennessee, and fragments flew in all directions like shrapnel. One of them tore through the captain's abdomen. Benyon fell but didn't lose consciousness. He continued giving orders, bleeding. Doris and several other sailors ran to him. They tried to move the commander to safety, but Benyon refused. "Leave me here," he said through the pain. "Do your jobs." His face was gray, his lips white, but his eyes remained clear. The ship continued taking torpedoes. 7 hits in the first minutes. The West Virginia listed more and more severely. If it capsized, like the battleship Oklahoma had already done, hundreds of men would be trapped. Officers made a desperate decision. They began flooding compartments on the starboard side. The ship slowly leveled out, settling to the bottom evenly. One of the officers, Lieutenant Frederick White, saw Doris. "Miller, to the gun!" He pointed at a Browning anti-aircraft mount where the crew had been knocked out. Doris had never fired this weapon. He hadn't been trained, but there was no time for explanations. He sat down at the gun. The mechanism was hot. Someone had fired it before him. Aiming handles, trigger, ammunition belt. Doris had seen how others used this weapon, watched during drills. Now it was time to act. A Japanese dive bomber emerged from a cloud of smoke, went into a descent. Doris swung the gun around, caught the plane in his sights, and pressed the trigger. The weapon came alive in his hands. The recoil was powerful, but he held the barrel steady, correcting his fire. Tracer rounds drew glowing lines in the air, reaching toward the aircraft. Did he hit it? Impossible to say. Dozens of guns were firing all around, but the plane wobbled and veered away. The next one, and another. Japanese planes came in waves. Doris fired, swinging the gun around, choosing targets. Shell casings rained at his feet. The air was filled with thunder, smoke, the smell of gunpowder and burning oil. The water around the ships was on fire. Spilled fuel had turned the harbor into hell. He fired for 15 minutes, maybe 20. Time lost meaning. When one ammunition belt ran out, he reloaded. When that gun finally went silent, he moved to another. Around him, men were falling. Fragments and bullets didn't choose. Someone screamed, calling for medics. Someone just lay motionless. Doris kept firing. When the second wave of the attack began to withdraw, he pulled away from the gun. The ship sat on the bottom, listing but not capsized. Wounded were everywhere. Doris began helping evacuate them. He lifted men into his arms, carried them to the side, lowered them into lifeboats. One sailor, burned almost completely, clung to him and hoarsely whispered, "Don't leave me. Don't leave me." Doris didn't leave him. He worked until the last wounded man had been taken off the ship. When the Japanese planes finally left, heavy black smoke hung over Pearl Harbor. The water in the harbor was covered with an oil slick, burning debris, and bodies. 8 battleships were destroyed or damaged, thousands dead. Doris Miller sat on the deck, leaning his back against a bulkhead. His uniform was soaked through with water and sweat, his face covered in soot. His hands trembled from exhaustion. He looked at the destroyed harbor and thought about how all of this was real. This wasn't a drill. This was war. The following days were a fog. Doris was transferred ashore along with the rest of the West Virginia's crew. The ship lay on the bottom, its masts sticking above the water. Captain Benyon was dead. 106 crew members didn't come home. The fleet began collecting reports. Officers gave testimony, described the actions of subordinates. Lieutenant White mentioned a black sailor who fired an anti-aircraft gun. Other officers confirmed it. Someone had seen this sailor carrying the wounded. But no one knew his name. In the first documents, he appeared as unknown black sailor. The system that had made black men invisible for years now couldn't find them, even when it was looking. It took several weeks for the name to surface. Doris Miller, Seaman 3rd Class, Cook. Commanders submitted a report recommending his commendation. This was unusual. A black man, a cook, being decorated for combat. Meanwhile, the story began taking on a life of its own. The press picked it up. America, shocked by Pearl Harbor, needed heroes. The story of the cook who manned a machine gun was perfect. African-American newspapers launched a campaign. The Pittsburgh Courier ran editorials demanding the hero be named. The Chicago Defender published letters from readers. Who is he? Where is he? Why is the Navy silent? In March 1942, the Navy relented. Official announcement. Seaman 3rd Class Doris Miller is awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary courage, the first African American to receive this honor. By that time, Doris had been transferred to the aircraft carrier USS Indianapolis. One morning, his commander told him that in a week he would fly to Pearl Harbor to receive the award. May 27, 1942, on the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, an honor guard formed up. Officers, sailors, journalists with cameras gathered. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, the man directing the war against Japan, was personally presenting the awards. Doris stood in formation with other recipients. His white uniform was pressed to perfection, his shoes gleaming. When Nimitz approached him, read the citation, and pinned the Navy Cross on his chest, Camera flashes sparkled by the dozens. The admiral shook his hand. "Good work, sailor." Doris answered as he always did. "Thank you, sir. I was just doing my job." After the ceremony, he was sent on a tour of the continental United States, selling war bonds, giving speeches, meeting with the public. In Oakland, thousands came to hear him. In Chicago, the African American community threw him a reception. In New York, the mayor shook his hand on the steps of City Hall. But there were strange moments, too. In one southern city where they brought him to speak, Doris couldn't enter the restaurant where the official dinner was planned. The establishment didn't serve black people. Organizers had to hastily change the venue. In another city, a taxi driver refused to take him. A war hero, a man with the Navy Cross on his chest, was still colored in many eyes. Doris didn't complain. He performed his duty, spoke, smiled for photographs, signed bonds. But inside, he was glad when the tour ended and he could return to the fleet. He was promoted to Seaman First Class. His pay increased. He still sent most of it home. And he was still a cook. The award hadn't changed the rules. Black sailors were still not admitted to combat specialties. In the summer of 1942, he was transferred to the escort carrier USS Liscombe Bay. New ship, new crew, same duties. November 1943. The war in the Pacific had ground through dozens of islands. Each one cost blood. The Japanese didn't surrender. They dug into the ground, built fortifications, fought to the last man. USS Liscombe Bay was part of Task Force 52, directed to capture Makin Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. These were small patches of land in the ocean, but strategically important. Control them, control the approaches to the Marshall Islands, and from there, the path to the Marianas and Japan. November 20th, the landing began. Marines went ashore under fire. Aircraft carriers provided air support. Planes took off from decks, bombed Japanese positions, returned, took off again. Liscombe Bay was working at capacity. The operation was going well. By November 23rd, resistance was broken. The island was almost in American hands. Another day or two of mopping up, and Task Force could move on. The night of November 23rd to 24th was quiet. Liscombe Bay patrolled waters around the atoll, along with other escort ships. The sea was calm. Watchstanders dozed at their posts. Most of the crew slept. Tomorrow there would be work again. In the pre-dawn darkness, at 5:10 a.m., no one noticed the periscope of Japanese submarine I-175. Captain Tabata had long tracked the convoy, waiting for the moment. Now the moment had come. He closed to firing range on Liscombe Bay. At 5:13, a torpedo left the tube. 40 seconds of travel. Silence. Then, impact. The torpedo struck the starboard side, directly in the area of the bomb magazines. What happened next wasn't just an explosion, it was catastrophe. The torpedo's detonation triggered the detonation of aviation bombs and torpedoes stored in the hold. The carrier was literally torn apart from within. A fireball rose hundreds of feet. The blast wave threw men overboard, scattered planes on the deck, ripped the hull's metal. On neighboring ships, miles away, sailors felt the impact. Liscombe Bay began sinking immediately. The hull was torn open, water rushed inside. Inside the ship, in berthing compartments and spaces, hundreds of men were trapped. The ship listed. Fire spread. Smoke filled corridors. Doris Miller was inside the ship. Where exactly, unknown. Perhaps in his quarters, perhaps already heading to the galley. The explosion was so powerful that people inside had no chance. 23 minutes later, Liscombe Bay disappeared beneath the water. Of 916 crew members, 644 died. Among them, Rear Admiral Henry Mullenix, Captain Irving Wiltsey, dozens of officers, hundreds of sailors, and Seaman First Class Doris Miller, 24 years old, cook, hero of Pearl Harbor, the first African American to receive the Navy Cross. The ocean claimed him. Quiet, indifferent, boundless. Henrietta Miller received a telegram in December 1943. The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you. Standard text that thousands of families received every week of the war. She sat on the porch of her house in Waco, holding the telegram in her hands. The cotton fields around were empty. The season had ended. She looked at the horizon and thought about her son, about the boy they'd given a girl's name, about the teenager who played football, about the young man who joined the Navy to help his family, about the hero whose photograph was printed in newspapers. The Navy sent his decorations. The Navy Cross that Admiral Nimitz had pinned on him. Other medals, posthumous. She folded them into a box and put it on a shelf. Sometimes she took them out, looked at them. But metal couldn't replace a son. The press published obituaries. Pearl Harbor hero dies in the line of duty. African American newspapers published long articles about his life, his heroism, his legacy. He became a symbol. But to Henrietta, he was simply Doris. After the war, the world began to change. Slowly, painfully, but it changed. In 1944, the Navy began opening combat specialties to black sailors. The death of Doris Miller and other African Americans who died in combat created pressure that the system could no longer ignore. How could you demand that people die for their country, but not give them equal opportunities? In 1948, President Truman signed an executive order desegregating the armed forces. By the early 1950s, the American military was integrated. Black and white served side by side, in the same units, with equal opportunities. Doris Miller didn't live to see this. But his heroism was part of the path to these changes. Years passed. In 1973, they launched the frigate USS Miller FF-1091. At the ceremony, Doris's mother attended, an old woman in a black dress who wept as the ship slipped into the water. It was the first U.S. Navy combat ship named after an African American. In 2019, on the centennial anniversary of Doris's birth, the Secretary of the Navy announced the newest aircraft carrier would bear the name USS Doris Miller CVN-81. The most modern, most powerful aircraft carrier in the world. A technological marvel worth billions of dollars. It will bear the name of a cook from Waco, Texas.